Okay, so let's talk about maximizing EV with showdown value as the preflop raiser. As the preflop caller, it would be a lot different. So it's easier to just only talk about playing as the preflop raiser. So basically, first I'm going to give a definition of showdown value, and then I'll introduce principles that provide an overview for flop play, and I'm going to use examples from these four common situations to help us understand what I mean and understand the concepts more. So first, a definition of showdown value. So it's generally like the middling part of a range. There are nuances to it because, some ranges have more middling hands than other ranges, but in general, it's just like the middling part of a range. Like, if it goes check, check, flop, turn, and river, then you're going to win pretty often. But it's not strong enough to go 3 streets for value. Like, it's strong enough to, at most, go 2 streets for value, but usually, 1 street for value or no value betting at all. And so, an example of showdown value, so button versus big blind, 10-5-2 rainbow. Top pair weak kicker, pocket pair below top pair, middle pair, bottom pair, and ace high. All of these are examples of showdown value. And so anything weaker than ace high, well, I guess you could consider king queen and king jack as close to being showdown value as well. But most king highs and worse are just air. And top pair good kicker on this board is going to be strong value. Yeah. Oh, I guess I said middling part of the range twice. Oh well. So yeah, there's no clear point necessarily. This is. So there's not a clear point where it goes from being value to being showdown value to being air. Necessarily, especially on the flop and pre-flop, then it's not so much you have a value hand or you have a bluff. It's more of where it is on the spectrum, between 0% equity and 100% equity. Most hands will be between 20 and 80% equity or whatever. And so you can't really calculate the showdown value just by the equity necessarily. So the main goals with showdown value are to, it seems pretty obvious, but to get to showdown, to deny equity from, oftentimes it's just denying equity from the opponent's really weak hands, and to get some value in some cases. Getting to showdown is the most important part. Is self-evident based on the name, but still good to remember that, I guess. And so the most important decision with showdown value is whether you bet the flop. There are some times that showdown value benefits from betting the flop, and so, we bet more often. And if not, then we check more often. And on the turn and the river, then most showdown value just checks turn unless it improves. Okay, I guess these slides are kind of messed up because I already gave away some of this, but yeah, and then river, you decide whether you value bet or not. On the 10-5-2, top pair weak kicker, if you bet flop, then a lot of the time you're just going to check back turn, and then on river, then you can usually value bet. But then something like bottom pair is just going to bet flop, check turn, and check river. And then some of the other hands are going to be bet some of the time on the river, like in the bet check bet line, like 9s through 6s. So the factors determining how often we bet flop. Flush draw versus rainbow is one of the topics we're going to cover. Does our hand have extra outs? And how often does our range bet? Which could also be said like, how likely are we going to get to showdown by betting versus checking? And these kind of, they'll apply to strong value hands and air as well, but just because we're talking about showdown value, then yeah. So flush draw versus rainbow. There are less draws on a rainbow board. I already covered that in my first presentation, but basically it just means that our value gets outdrawn less often. So we can bet more often with our range and also with showdown value hands. So yeah, so this example, so small blind opens, big blind 3-bets to 9 big blinds or whatever, small blind calls. So on rainbow, then there is 36% checking and there's 49% checking on flush draw boards. So you're checking like 13% more often. Yeah. And so, yeah, basically like you just have to bet way more polar on flush draw boards. And this happens also like button versus big blind, small blind 3-bet versus button, like in single raise pots and 3-bet pots this happens. 4-bet pots are a little bit different because basically ranges are a lot tighter, so then sex pot ratio is lower, so then like flush draw versus rainbow, it doesn't matter as much. Like if you have an overpair or you have top pair, like most likely you're going to try to get all in a 4-bet pot because the sex pot ratio is so low. So if there's a flush draw, then it's not going to make you check more often. I think. I haven't really checked that actually, but I think that's true. And whoops. So a specific example, Queen Jack 5 rainbow. Yeah, so this is still big blind 3-bet versus small blind. So blind v blind 3-bet pot. Queen Jack 5 rainbow versus Queen Jack 5 flush draw. And we're just looking at middle pair hands. So these are definitely showdown value. And on the rainbow board, then there's 55% checking. And it goes all the way up to 82% checking on the flush draw board. So when there's a flush draw present, it's much more important that we just try to get to showdown. So the easiest way to get to showdown is just by checking back. Whereas on the rainbow board, these hands can go for thin value against, 9s through 6s and, some of the better Jack X, then they could get some value from worse Jack X and all that. So like on the rainbow board, you just don't have to be as worried about draws coming in. So you can value bet thinner with showdown value. Yeah, and there's just more flop betting with showdown value on rainbow boards than flush draw boards. And then on turns and rivers, then it's similar between those two because if you already split your range on the flop, then on turn it's easier to play. Oh, and I forgot to say, yeah, green is check, orange is 35% pot, and purple is 50% pot. So like an interesting thing that actually happens too is that on flush draw boards, since we're barely betting, then when we do bet, we mostly just bet half pot here. But then on rainbow boards, then there's 35% and 50% pot. So I guess I'm not sure exactly the reason for that, but I would say perhaps middle pair can kind of function a little bit as a bluff more often on flush draw boards, but I don't know if that's actually true. It's probably not true, to be honest. But yeah. So the second principle, does our hand have extra outs? If we have multiple backdoors or multiple ways to improve against our opponent's showdown value, then we can play our hand more aggressively. Like if we have backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, overcard, especially if you have like 2 overcards, then it's usually pretty good to bet. Yeah, it's more likely to be that we'll be able to value bet on a future street. So yeah, so if we look at this like ace 5 and we compare ace 5 with a backdoor flush draw to ace 5 with no backdoor flush draw, then ace 5 with backdoor flush draw can bet most of the time, and the same goes for ace 4. But ace 5 with no backdoors just always checks back. So it's just ace 5 with, or ace 4 with no backdoor flush draw just wants to give up. And like also with the overcards, then like ace king and ace queen, they bet really often. They're not really often, but like 70% of the time. Because they have 2 overcards, whereas ace 10, ace 9, ace 8, ace 7, they only have 1 overcard and they don't have a backdoor straight draw, whereas like ace 5 and ace 4 at least have a backdoor straight draw. And so when you have the backdoor flush draw and a backdoor straight draw and an overcard, then having like three different types of extra equity really help, especially because like, okay, if you have a backdoor flush draw, then you can backdoor a flush. Backdoor straight draw, you can backdoor a straight, and you can hit top pair. So like being able to hit different ranks is really helpful. Also, it gives you more equity. Like it gives you 3% more equity to have a backdoor flush draw than not. So that 3.5% extra equity goes a long way to being able to bet more often. Because like, on turn, if you hit a flush draw, well, now you can barrel because you have the nut flush draw. And so it's a really valuable hand. Yeah, being able to run a runner, the nut flush is really valuable. Yeah, and also like if you look at the EVs, this is the EV. So like the EVs for ace 5 with the backdoor flush draw is like 2.18 to 2.26. Without a backdoor flush draw, it's 1. So literally it's out of a 18 big blind pot that you like ace 5 without a backdoor flush draw wins like the EV captured out of the total pot of 18 is like 5.5%. Like 5.5% of the pot. Like you're gonna win 5.5% of what is in the pot if you have ace 5 with no backdoor flush draw. But then if you do have a backdoor flush draw, then it's like 11% or whatever. It's like more than double the value. So like that's a huge difference. Yeah. And the last factor for determining how often you bet is how often our range bets. The more often our range bets, the more often our showdown value bets. And that also is the case with most of our strong value hands and our air as well. Like, if most of our range bets, then of course our air wants to bet too. more often than it would if we bet less often. So usually we bet really often if we're at a big advantage. So basically then you have more fold equity. Yeah, I mean, like a good example of this is like small blind 3-bet versus button. Then like double Broadway boards are really good for the small blind 3-bet range. And so even just by betting like 25% pot, you get them to fold a lot of underguard or like under pairs and a lot of unpaired hands. And even on some of the ace high double Broadway boards in that situation, then they start folding pairs and stuff. So like you can use really small bets often, and they're just going to fold often, and it's just good for your entire range. But it's especially good for your showdown value, because if you bet like okay, let's say it's like whatever, we don't need a specific example, but basically like if you bet with a, you know, if you have 30, 40, 50, 60%, 70% equity, any of the, like within that range, then getting them to fold a certain amount of equity against your hand is really good, especially because in certain situations they actually have decent equity against your hand. So getting them to fold, there's like a tiny element to, like, it's kind of a bluff in a really small way. Like it's mostly like a value bet, but a little bit like a bluff. So like most of the benefit of betting showdown value is getting folds. So if they like fold more than MDF, then we can bet more often. Well, if they fold a lot more often than MDF, then we can bet more often. But if they slightly overfold, then it's not like we can just range bet necessarily. I mean, maybe some circumstances that it could happen, but yeah. And also it's a function of bet sizing. So yeah, when we're at a range advantage, we can use more small bets, and that allows us to thinly value bet more easily. If you only use middling to big bets like half pot, 3/4 pot, you know, 2 pot, then middling pairs can't value bet at all. And even like, you know, there can be some value betting with like top pair weak kicker. You know, on some boards that happens often. But if you only use like half pot or pot, then on most boards, then you're gonna have to check back more often. So go back to Jack 6-2. Okay, actually let's go back to, yeah, okay, so like big blind 3-bet v small blind. So like ace 9-7. Okay, if you have pocket kings, queens, jacks, tens, you still want to bet some frequency of the time, because getting them to fold, like, you know, if they have one overcard, then they're going to fold. Or, you know, especially if they have two overcards, like, I think there maybe are some circumstances where, like, if you bet 25% pot, then, yeah, they're just going to fold some overcards, like, you know, queen 10, king jack, stuff like that without a backdoor flush draw, they're going to fold. And so it's really valuable for our like middling hands, like showdown value hands, to bet often when we're at an advantage, and like when they're going to fold a reasonable frequency of the time. And like you can think about it from a not an exploitative standpoint, but I guess like it, you know, if they never fold to you ever, if you have zero fold equity, then you just bet based on your raw equity. You just, whatever hands are value bets, then you value bet it, and then you never bluff, and you never bet your middling hands, basically. You can just check down to the river or whatever. Well, you can value bet more thinly too. But that's just an extreme example, but it's basically like, the point is that generally if we're betting really often, then we usually want to size down. One counter example to that, and it's not very common, is like small blind 3-bet versus button. Then on king high rag boards, so when no straight or flush comes in on the flop, then we can just bet half pot to 3/4 pot with our entire range, like no matter what. But that's just because we're at such a huge advantage that like we're at a range advantage and also at a nut advantage, so we want to size up. But in most cases, then when you bet way more often, then you usually want to bet on the small side. Okay. So an example: small blind versus big blind, single raise pot. So this is like the small blind C bet. Ace 9-6 rainbow. We just always bet. We bet our entire range. And this purple is small bet, so it's quarter pot. And 10-7-2 flush draw, then there's a lot of checking. I don't know how much checking overall, but like 50 to 60% checking or something. Oh, okay. Yeah, 55% checking. So because we're betting all of our value hands, all of our air, then we also want to bet our showdown value. And like, you know, if you bet quarter pot here, then they're going to be folding a decent amount. Like a lot of their crappy hands have bricked this flop, and so just betting small will just get a decent amount of folds. Versus like 10-7-2 flush draw, then basically you don't want to bet that often. Well, like we talked about already, like flush draw boards you want to check more often, and also they just have a lot more straight draws to, well, they just have a lot more like straight draws and pair draws and stuff to continue on 10-7-2 than ace 9-6. And also ace 9-6, then we as a small blind have 26% top pair, and 10-7-2 we only have 19% top pair. And I'm not sure what it is for a big blind, but basically we just have a big advantage on ace 9-6, and we leverage that by betting often for small. Yeah, and we can just bet our middling hands always here. I mean, even if it's like, you know, if it's some board where you bet like 80% of the time with your range, then you know, it depends on the hand type, but your showdown value hands will bet between, you know, probably 50 and 90% of the time. So your bet frequency with showdown value will be in the ballpark of how often you see bet with your whole range. And this just keeps us balanced. So it's not like you're just betting like way too much value or way too many bluffs. And so an example of betting versus checking flop. So button versus big blind, single raise pot, king jack 5 flush draw. So on this board we're betting pretty polar. I don't think there's any small sizings. Maybe like half pot and pot I think are the sizings. So if we have ace jack, so we have second pair top kicker, it's definitely showdown value. We bet just under 50% of the time with ace jack on the flop. You know, betting and checking are both okay. You can get some value and fold out some hands by betting, and checking back you can try to get to showdown. So it's it's just a middling hand. So after betting 50% off flop, then we check around 80% of the time on the turn after we bet half pot on flop and they call, then we mostly check back, especially on a low card. We just always check back. But with the same ace jack, after checking back the flop, we also check back 80% of the time. So like the bet frequency stays similar regardless of the line. But how often you bet on each specific card depends on the flop action. So like on a low card, after it checks back, well, now we can value bet sometimes. Whereas after betting flop, half pot, then we no longer have a value hand that can keep value betting the next street. So we have to check back there. And also there's a difference, like when it comes at 10, then for some reason we're turning ace jack into a bluff after betting flop. But then after checking back flop, then we mostly just check back. And there's some difference with bet sizing as well, but mostly actually there's just smaller sizing after betting flop. But that's just with this specific hand. Most of our range wants to bet like pot on turn in either case, like for the most part, except for like high card turns. So basically, if we bet flop and they call and it goes check check on turn, then this is out of position's probe strategy on river, and this is the out of position's probe strategy on river after it goes check check flop, check check turn, and now it's the river. So in both cases, similar amount of betting. After calling flop, then their range is a little bit stronger, so they can go for more small bets because they have a stronger range than they would if no bets went in on a flop. But it's fairly similar. Like, there's not too big of a difference. And but if we always bet ace jack on the flop, or we never bet ace jack on the flop, and like other showdown value, then out of position strategy would change a bunch. Like if we never bet middle pair on the flop, then once you get to the river in that line, then they can probably value bet thinner with their like third pair hands and stuff like that. But if we always check, and if we always check back ace jack, then once it goes check 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 check, then we're a little bit stronger on the river in positions. So basically, you want to have a decent amount of showdown value in both lines, regardless. But depending on the situation, then it can change. So just as a quick. Let's just go back. So showdown value is the middle part of the range. And just a quick summary. Showdown value is the middle part of the range. It's like middle pairs, weak pairs, top pair, weak kicker, like ace high and single raise pot. Ace high isn't really it's not showdown value in like a 3-bet pot because the ranges are too strong for you to check down and win. Our main goal is showdown value. Get to showdown, deny equity, and get some value. Get to showdown is the most important though. Flop is the most important street for deciding how you're going to play your hand. I mean, showdown value benefit. If it benefits from betting, then you bet often, and if not, then you check back more often. And then turn is just there's a lot of checking. And river, you just have to decide whether you want to value bet or not. Flush draw versus rainbow. On a flush draw board, there's a lot more checking back with our range and with showdown value, and then rainbow boards you can value bet thinner. Does your hand have extra outs? If it does have extra outs, then oftentimes we can bet more often. And how often your range bets. If your range bets often, then your showdown value can bet more often too. Is there something else? Oh yeah, and if you have a range advantage, then you can just bet flop more often with showdown value, check turn, and then out of position won't probe the river as often as if you weren't at a big advantage. Yeah. So, I mean, these are the main things. Get to showdown. Check more on flush draw boards. Bet more often if you have extra outs, and bet more often if you have like if your range bets more often. And that's especially just like with if you have a big range advantage. If you have a small range advantage, then you'll probably bet somewhat frequently. Like you're not going to be range checking or range betting, so it'll be somewhere in between. And yeah, kind of already touched on this, but yeah, if you're at a big range advantage, then you're going to be able to get to showdown easier because they're not going to bet into you. But and so by betting, betting is good. But then if you are at a range disadvantage, then checking more often is better.